Tattoos. The ancient and mysterious history. Humans have marked their bodies with tattoos for thousands of years. These permanent designs, sometimes plain, sometimes elaborate, always personal, have served as amulets, status symbols, declarations of love, signs of religious beliefs, adornments, and even forms of punishment. Joan Fletcher, a research fellow in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York in Britain, describes the history of tattoos and their cultural significance to people around the world, from the famous Iceman, a 5,200-year-old frozen mummy, to today's Maori. In terms of tattoos on actual bodies, the earliest known examples were for a long time Egyptian and were present on several female mummies dated to c. 2000 BC. But following the more recent discovery of the Iceman from the area of the Italian-Austrian border in 1991 and his tattoo patterns, this date has been pushed back a further 1,000 years, when he was carbon dated at around 5,200 years old. Can you describe the tattoos on the Iceman and their significance? Following discussions with my colleague Professor Don Brothwell of the University of York, one of the specialists who examined him, the distribution of the tattooed dots and small crosses on his lower spine and right knee and ankle joints correspond to areas of strain-induced degeneration, with the suggestion that they may have been applied to alleviate joint pain and were therefore essentially therapeutic. This would also explain their somewhat random distribution in areas of the body which would not have been that easy to display had they been applied as a form of status marker. What is the evidence that ancient Egyptians had tattoos? There's certainly evidence that women had tattoos on their bodies and limbs from figurine c. 4000 to 3500 BC to occasional female figures represented in tomb scenes c. 1200 BC and in figurine form c. 1300 BC, all with tattoos on their thighs. Also, small bronze implements identified as tattooing tools were discovered at the town site of Gurob in northern Egypt and dated to c. 1450 BC. And then, of course, there are the mummies with tattoos, from the 3 women already mentioned and dated to c. 2000 BC to several later examples of female mummies, with these forms of permanent marks found in Greco-Roman burials at Akhmim. What function did these tattoos serve? Who got them and why? Because this seemed to be an exclusively female practice in ancient Egypt, mummies found with tattoos were usually dismissed by the male excavators who seemed to assume the women were of dubious status, described in some cases as dancing girls. The female mummies had nevertheless been buried at Deir el-Bahari, opposite modern Luxor, in an area associated with royal and elite burials, and we know that at least one of the women described as probably a royal concubine was actually a high-status priestess named Amunit, as revealed by her funerary inscriptions. And although it has long been assumed that such tattoos were the mark of prostitutes or were meant to protect women against sexually transmitted diseases, I personally believe that the tattooing of ancient Egyptian women had a therapeutic role and functioned as a permanent form of amulet during the very difficult time of pregnancy and birth. This is supported by the pattern of distribution, largely around the abdomen, on top of the thighs and the breasts, and would also explain the specific types of designs, in particular, the net-like distribution of dots applied over the abdomen. During pregnancy, the pattern would expand in a protective fashion in the same way bead nets were placed over wrapped mummies to protect them and keep everything in. The placing of small figures of the household deity, bees, at the tops of their thighs would again suggest the use of tattoos as a means of safeguarding the actual birth, since bees was the protector of women in labor, and his position at the tops of the thighs was a suitable location. This would ultimately explain tattoos as a purely female custom. Who made the tattoos? Although we have no explicit written evidence in the case of ancient Egypt, it may well be that the older women of a community would create the tattoos for the younger women, as happened in 19th century Egypt and happens in some parts of the world today. What instruments did they use? It is possible that an implement best described as a sharp point set in a wooden handle, dated to c. 3000 BC, and discovered by archaeologist F.H.D at the site of Abydos, may have been used to create tattoos. Petrie also found the aforementioned set of small bronze instruments c. 1450 BC, resembling wide, flattened needles, at the ancient town site of Gurob. If tied together in a bunch, they would provide repeated patterns of multiple dots. These instruments are also remarkably similar to much later tattooing implements used in 19th century Egypt. The English writer William Lane, 1801 to 1876, observed, "The operation is performed with several needles, generally 7, tied together. With these, the skin is pricked in a desired pattern. Some smoke black, of wood or oil, mixed with milk from the breast of a woman, is then rubbed in. It is generally performed at the age of about 5 or 6 years, and by gypsy women." What did these tattoos look like? Most examples of mummies are largely dotted patterns of lines and diamond patterns, while figurines sometimes feature more naturalistic images. The tattoos are occasionally found in tomb scenes and on small female figurines which form part of cosmetic items, and also have small figures of the dwarf god base on the thigh area. What were they made of? How many colors were used? Usually, a dark or black pigment such as soot was introduced into the pricked skin. It seems that brighter colors were largely used in other ancient cultures, such as the Inuit, who are believed to have used a yellow color along with the usual darker pigments. What has surprised you the most about ancient Egyptian tattooing? That it appears to have been restricted to women during the purely dynastic period, pre-332 BC. Also, the way in which some of the designs can be seen to be very well placed. Once it is accepted they were used as a means of safeguarding women during pregnancy and birth. Can you describe the tattoos used in other ancient cultures and how they differ? Among the numerous ancient cultures that appear to have used tattooing as a permanent form of body adornment, the Nubians to the south of Egypt are known to have used tattoos. The mummified remains of women of the indigenous C group culture, found in cemeteries near Kuban c. 2015,000 BC, were found to have blue tattoos, which in at least one case featured the same arrangement of dots across the abdomen noted on the aforementioned female mummies from Deir el-Bahari. The ancient Egyptians also represented the male leaders of the Libyan neighbors c. 1300 to 1100 BC with clear, rather geometrical tattoo marks on their arms and legs, and portrayed them in Egyptian tombs, temples, and palace scenes. The Scythian Pazyryk of the Altai mountain region was another ancient culture that employed tattoos. In 1948, the 2,400-year-old body of a Scythian male was discovered preserved in ice in Siberia, his limbs and torso covered in ornate tattoos of mythical animals. Then, in 1993, a woman with tattoos, again of mythical creatures on her shoulders, wrists, and thumb, and of similar date, was found in a tomb in Altai. The practice is also confirmed by the Greek writer Herodotus c. 450 BC, who stated that amongst the Scythians and Thracians tattoos were a mark of nobility, and not to have them was the testimony of low birth. Evidence for tattooing is also found amongst some of the ancient mummies found in China's Taklamakan Desert c. 1200 BC, although during the later Han Dynasty, 202 BC and 220, it seems that only criminals were tattooed. Japanese men began adorning their bodies with elaborate tattoos in the late 83rd century. The elaborate tattoos of the Polynesian cultures are thought to have developed over millennia, featuring highly elaborate geometric designs, which in many cases can cover the whole body. Following James Cook's British expedition to Tahiti in 1769, the islanders' term tatato, or tattoo, meaning to hit or strike, gave the West our modern term tattoo. The marks then became fashionable among Europeans, particularly so in the case of men such as sailors and coal miners, with both professions carrying serious risks and presumably explaining the almost amulet-like use of anchors or miners' lout tattoos on the men's forearms. What about modern tattoos outside of the Western world? Modern Japanese tattoos are real works of art, with many modern practitioners, while the highly skilled tattooists of Samoa continue to create their art as it was carried out in ancient times, prior to the invention of modern tattooing equipment. Various cultures throughout Africa also employ tattoos, including the fine dots on the faces of Berber women in Algeria, the elaborate facial tattoos of Warabi men in Niger, and the small crosses on the inner forearms which mark Egypt's Christian Copts. Why do you think so many cultures have marked the human body, and did their practices influence one another? In many cases, it seems to have sprung up independently as a permanent way to place protective or therapeutic symbols upon the body, then as a means of marking people out into appropriate social, political, or religious groups, or simply as a form of self-expression or fashion statement.